Welcome GRD132 Typography, Spring 2021, and I'm going to guide you through some of the reading here. I won't always do this, but I thought it'd be a good idea since there's a lot of terminology being thrown at you. I'm going to try to guide you through it a little bit from the textbook and show you some examples too. I won't do this for every chapter, but I'm going to do it right now because I think it might help a little bit instead of just looking at the book. Now, this is the online book, the Exploring Typography, and I just wanted to go through a couple things here. One of the first things you'll see is this, and this is pretty easy to understand. You have the descender, you have the ascender, you have the descender line, you have the ascender line, you have the cap height, you have X height. That's all stuff that's pretty easy to understand. And one thing you might be wondering, why is there an ascender line and a cap height? Well, sometimes they're different. Here they're slightly different. And if I go over to here into Gravit, and I just want to point out I have a serif font here, Crimson Pro. I have its italic version, and then I have a different font here, Gentium Basic, which is a different serif font, and I have a sans serif font. And in this one, Crimson Pro, the regular version here, I'll zoom into this. You can see on both of these, the Crimson Pro and the Gentium, you can see the cap height is different than the Ascender. So that is something that is different. That's why you can't always measure point size of fonts by just measuring the capital letter. There's little tools with C's on there and E's that you sometimes do that, but that just approximates it. It doesn't always get the full scope of the font size, and we'll talk about that as we go through here, talk about point size and how that comes about. The counters, the counterforms, all those kind of things. The counterforms are basically the negative spaces, and we're more concerned about the counters, the inside. And there's closed counters, which you'll see on B's and O's and D's, and there's also open counters. And these things that surround them are called the bowls. The things that surround the closed counters are called the bowls. You'll see them, and if I look here, we could see we have, these are the counters, these are the counters on the inside, and these are the bowls on the outside. Even the R has a bowl. P has a bowl. And I should have put a P in here. I guess I will at some point, because P's can be very distinctive of the font as well. Sometimes there's some P's where they don't connect down here, and it looks just like the R, and sometimes it doesn't. So we'll bring that up later. But anyway, that's the counters and bowls. So we'll keep moving on here. You could know what the crotch is. You could see that, and you know what the apex is on letter A's and things like that. The E's has something called an I in the middle. It's a closed counter. They call that the I, and the way to remember that is it's on an E, and it's one of the few that has an I, and if you look at it, it kind of looks like an I guess a little bit, and there's an open counter on the bottom. We know ascenders and descenders. They talk about strokes. Stem strokes are kind of these straight strokes. Hairline strokes are kind of the secondary strokes. And you'll see that a lot on serif fonts. If we look at our serif fonts, you could see on the straight ones here, we could see these are more the hairline strokes on the W, and these are more of the stem strokes. And you'll see that a lot. These aren't very prominent. There'll be other fonts where it'll be a little more prominent. That thick, thin contrast will be a little bit more pronounced, but it's not really on either of these. This is kind of a lighter serif font. This is a little heavier serif font, but they're not very pronounced as far as their thick, thin contour, and we'll talk about that more. And here's a couple things here just to point out. They talk about cross strokes, and that's pretty much where they cross. So if we look at cross strokes here, do we have any cross strokes? Well, we have them in the X. We also have them in the italic version of the X, and it's just worth pointing out that if you look at the cross strokes, they're different. One has kind of a serif coming down and a serif coming up, and the serifs or the tails on this cross stroke are a little more rounder. If I zoom into there, you can really kind of look at that a little bit more, and you can see just looking at an italic version of the letter X, it's a little bit more complex. They're not the same kind of letters here. The ends of these are very different than the ends of those. Also, when you look at the letter F, the descender, if you look at these, there's actually kind of a descender on the italic F. It actually has kind of a tail coming down, even a little more pronounced than the J. On the regular version of the font, it doesn't. It has a straight bottom on this, or a straight serif at the bottom, and this has a tail. And the P has a straight serif, where the italic P, that still has a straight tail, so that stays pretty much the same. The F changes a little bit. It's a little more fluid. Going back to the reading, crossbars, and I also had to look this up because I don't think they mention this in here, but it's worth mentioning when you look at capital E's, and I'll zoom into these two capital E's here between these two fonts, because a lot of times you'll compare fonts by the E's, and if you look at these here, what's this thing called? What's the middle thing called? Because it's not a crossbar, because a crossbar is meant to connect things like an H, and I don't even think we have a capital H here like they show in here. we may have an A, but these are crossbars, ones that go across, and they usually connect two parts. And we don't really have crossbars, I don't think, on these examples here, but this is called a bar here, and this is called a arm on the top. There's an arm, and this is called a bar here. So I just wanted to point that out. And moving down here, we have things like tails, we have legs. Why would you need to know that? Well, if you needed to describe the difference between the tail on the Q versus the tail on this Q, they're very different. You know, it almost looks like a tail of an animal or something the way it comes out. This one kind of curves up with a little bit of, almost like a serif on it. And also legs. How is this leg different than that leg? Well, this leg is kind of rounded at the bottom of its terminal. The terminal is where it ends, and it doesn't really have a serif. It kind of has a little bit of a corner there, but at the terminal of the leg, see, I'm trying to use terminology now. The terminal of the leg, it kind of rounds off. The terminal of this leg, it has like a little boot on it. I guess you could say it has a little boot on it, but it has a little beak on it that kind of comes out, a little serif that comes out. So these are example of legs, and you'll see those on K's and R's. I don't know if we have a K here, but we definitely have an R, and usually the legs on R's are very distinctive. And here's talking about the junctions of strokes. I'm not going to worry too much about the junction of strokes right now, the way the tops are. We'll talk about them in more detail, but just notice that they can all be different, and they're all at the apex. And here's shoulders, squared shoulders, rounded shoulders. Now, do we ever have to talk about shoulders? Well, let's look at shoulders here. Here's shoulder between these two fonts. Are these different? They are a little bit. These are kind of angled. They have like a steeper kind of, they push to the right a little bit. On this one down here, you can see how the shoulders are kind of, there's a steeper angle on the right side, where here they're pretty uniform. The arch is pretty uniform. Now they still have that thick, thin kind of feel to them. They still have a tapering where they're thinner and then they get thicker. They're thinner. They do the same thing here, but there's more of an angle, more of a steeper angle here, as opposed to more of a kind of an equal arch here. And you might never think about stuff like that, but now we're looking at those kind of things, and we're going to try to use as much terminology as we can to understand it a little bit better. Now, there's a lot about G's. Just one letter here, they're talking about spurs. Now, I always call these the goatee. If you look at a G here, this one doesn't have a spur, this one doesn't have a spur, and this one does. It has a little goatee on it. That's the spur. And also the small g's, or the lowercase g's, for using the right term. This has an ear, it has a link and a loop. The link is what's connecting it. Here's the ear, and this is the loop at the bottom. Now, G's won't always look like that, but even the sans serif right here has the ear, it has the link, and it has the loop in the bottom, very squared off, kind of flat oval down at the bottom, almost like an icon. This thing could almost act like its own icon for something. But there's a lot of things about G's, and G's are very distinctive. They have their own style, goatees, and sometimes they come in more, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they won't have a serif on here. Sometimes they will. Sometimes they'll just go up straight. There's a lot of fonts that just kind of go up straight, so we'll talk about more of those, but there's a lot of things about G's here, but these are all pretty standard with serifs on there, but there's a lot of flat ones too. And again, G's can be very different, where they'll just have a loop on the bottom, and it won't be enclosed. A lot of them have enclosed loops. This one does not. So a lot of G's, just when you write a letter G, you don't draw a G like that. You draw it this way. When you're just kind of using handwriting, you'll probably put a G like that. Or if you're using cursive or a signature, you might do it like that with a loop. So you'll see G's in both ways. Probably never even realize that that's going to the right and that's going to the left. It's kind of odd when you think about it, but these are the things you're going to think about a little bit more with typography. Now, these G's I think are all pretty standard. They were all the same kind that are going to the right, that are actually facing the right. And here's a whole page on G's. And again, terminals is the end point of a stroke. I was trying to use that term when talking about the end of a leg and what's at the bottom. Now, there's serifs, and we know what serifs are by looking at serifs. Those are these little feet at the bottom, and they have all kinds of characteristics that we'll talk about if you really zoom into these. You know, there's the brackets. Sometimes it's very rounded in this area here. Sometimes these serifs at the end have rounded edges on them. Sometimes they're pointy. Sometimes the bottoms of these kind of arch up, so they kind of have an arch, so they don't sit flat. There's all kinds of things that these serifs can have. So there's lots of things related to these serifs. Even these things have terms like I just call them serifs, but they actually have terms like beaks and barbs and stuff like that. So these would actually be the beaks, and I guess barbs would actually have a little extra thing on them, like like a C. I don't know if I have capital C's down here. These have kind of equal beaks coming in, but they don't really have barbs. A barb is when they kind of come up. Think about it like if you're a fish and this was a hook, and there are barbs on fish hooks. If you were a fish and you came up here, probably you could pull it out, but if it had a little thing sticking up here, it's going to get caught. So that's what a barb is. So always remember the barb is that little extra thing that's going to catch. But these are kind of the beaks on here. I mean, you could say serif. Technically, they're serifs because they look like the serifs that you'll see in other things. Typically, serifs are the feet. But you'll also see serifs on all parts of the letters, but they have some other terms here. But you could call these things the beaks coming out of here. Remember, this thing is a bar. These are the arms, and you'll see crossbars in the letter H's. But what would you call that? What would you call this thing on an E? I would probably say it has a kind of serif coming out from it, but you could say it has somewhat of a beak coming out of the letter E, that the bar coming out has an extra serif on it, or it actually has a beak on it. You could say that. Now, I don't know if we have to be that detailed, but we are going to want to describe things, so we should at least know what we're talking about when we do that. Looked at this letter E, I could say, oh, well, this has a beak coming up, and it has a beak coming down, and then actually it looks like a beak of like an eagle or something. And then also the bar coming out doesn't really have a beak. It has kind of it starts to come out as a beak, and it's kind of cut off. So, I don't know if there's a word for every single thing that you'll see, but it definitely does not have a serif coming out from its bar. It definitely has something kind of looping down and being cut off. It's almost like this character here. It's almost like this beak here, except, if you just kind of lassoed this bottom part and cut it off. That's kind of what's happening here. So it's kind of a cut off version of that top part. So, it's good to kind of explore some of this, to know these characters a little bit better. So we're almost done here, just kind of guiding you through. And this is a real interesting part. I'm going to kind of zoom into this stuff here. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but they do talk about all these serifs here. The oblique end, there's a rounded end, like on almost typewriter type has a rounded end. There's cupped bottoms, meaning of the serifs. There's cupped bottoms of the serifs. There's like an arch on the bottom. They have splayed, where they kind of flare out. Sometimes they'll use the term flare serif, where they kind of flare out. They have pointed ones. They have flat ones, like slab serifs. Sometimes the serifs are squared off. So there's all kinds of things you'll see. And they even talk about the brackets, the way they connect, the way the stroke connects to the serif. There's different ways they connect. Sometimes they're more kind of squarish. Bracketed serif has a curved wedge. So they talk about all these things here too. And this is where they talk about beaks and barbs. So again, barb has that little thing coming off. Beaks are just kind of sticking down. So they're like serifs that aren't on the bottom, but are just kind of sticking out more, kind of on the sides, if you look at it that way. So beaks are kind of sticking out on the sides, whereas serifs are on the bottom. Although they really are serifs, but I guess it's a little more specialized serif. I guess that's what you could call beaks, as a specialized serif. And they mentioned swashes. I'm not going to get into swashes right now because that's on more decorative kind of type. Contrast and stroke weight, we'll talk about that. Angle of stress, I think I talked about that in the first video. You can see the angle of stress, it's a little off. It's not a real harsh angle, it's a little bit off. And let's see the cue here. Here it looks a little more straighter, although there's still an angle, because you go from where it gets thinner there to where it gets thinner there. So that's the angle of stress. It's kind of this is kind of an odd shaped character here, but that's what they're talking about. And you won't really see it sometimes in the C's and in the G's, but you will see it in some letters like the O's. Even the S's will sometimes have their own little angle. And by the way, that's called the spine on an S, that little, what connects the top loop to the bottom loop, or where the counter is. I guess that's the counter, and it's kind of a half bowl. But where the counter is, I would call it a counter. There's two counters on an S, and then there's kind of a spine going through. And sometimes they're more open, sometimes they're almost closed. There's all kinds of things that you'll see with S's as well. And again, they talk about no contrast, low contrast, high contrast. If you looked at these, I'd say these are kind of low contrast. I call it the thick-thin kind of combination. If you look at the W, the thick-thin, there's not a real high contrast. And these, they're even less. There's almost very little contrast between the thick and thin here. Some letters will have a really high contrast. Modern fonts will have a very heavy one and a very thin letter, which means their fonts you don't want to use at small sizes. These fonts will hold up well at small sizes because they're kind of uniform. That's why sans serif fonts, now we didn't really talk about the sans serif font, but one thing to point out about the sans serif font that I pointed out before is that they have very high X heights. the capital letters aren't very much higher than their X height, so they're very easy to read at smaller sizes. They're very clear to read on the, on bottles of, you'll see ingredients and all kinds of things, street signs, highway signs, everything will be in sans serif. Signs that you'll see inside a building, anything like that where you have to see it from far away, you'll typically see a more uniform kind of font with a higher X height. Now, they will have some subtle tapering. If you look at these, if you look at the letter N, it is a little thinner here than over here. So you will see some subtle stylization, but generally it's a little more even. The contrast is a little more even overall. You won't see high contrast in sans serif fonts. And again, sans serif fonts means there's no serifs on the bottom. Sans means without, so there's no serifs on the bottom. And you can see even on here, the T is kind of small. The ascenders of T's a lot of times are smaller than the other ascenders. And one thing I want to point out, I just looked at this letter A here, and it's kind of the one facing to the left. When you draw an A, you probably just put a circle with a line coming down, but they have this little roof on it. I call it the Flintstone car roof. You guys probably don't remember the Flintstones, but they had a car with a little roof on it, and that's what I always think of with that type of letter A, with the Flintstone roof. And there's the Flintstone roof, and when it's italic, sometimes that goes away. Here's the Flintstone roof. By the way, that's not a technical term. I just call it the Flintstone roof. This one doesn't have the Flintstone roof. This is an A just like you draw it. If you're using a pencil or pen, you'd probably draw an A just like that. It has a little kind of serif curling up at the end. And that's what happens with italic fonts. The font itself changes. They have kind of curled terminals and serifs that kind of bend and curl just like calligraphy a little bit. They'll be very different than the actual font. A lot of the letters will be completely different. That's why it is a different font. That's why also, if that font doesn't have an italic version, you don't just want to hit the I button, because then it'll just put it on an angle and it'll create something called an oblique letter and not really italic. Italics are stylized. They should look like this. They should look like almost a script font or a calligraphic type of font. And sans serif fonts, when you put them in italic, the ones down here, they'll just kind of go on an angle. So italic doesn't really just mean on an angle. On an angle is oblique. If it's italic, it should really be a curly italic like that, or a scripty italic is what that means. So let's kind of wrap this up here, going through here. I think we hit a lot of terms and type measurements. The only thing I want you to know right now, we might go into more depth, is that there's 72 points to an inch. That means there's 6 picas in an inch. So what is a pica? Pica is 12 points. And if you just remember that, it's kind of the size of standard text is 12 point. So body copy of fonts is like a pica a lot of times. And when I worked at a printer, and they a lot of times would have a pica ruler, but they're equivalent to inches. It's just a little bit different. It's just a little bit different of terminology when we use picas. And when you're saying picas endpoints, so if something is a pica and let's say something is 18 points, that would be 1 P6. That would be 1 pica, which is 12 points, and then 6 points. So it's kind of like using feet and inches a little bit, I guess, in that kind of way. So you might see something with a pica, which is 12 points, and then anything less than that, you would say P. So if something was 14 points, you would say 1 P2. 1 pica, 2 points. That's the way it would kind of be. And we'll talk more about these measurements because we're throwing a lot of terms at you. But hopefully this helped you a little bit by looking at this a little, by looking at some of this a little bit and looking at some of these examples. We're going to do lots of this, but just because there's a lot of reading and a lot of terminology in that first chapter that we're going over, I just wanted to show you some real examples of being here in Gravit and just looking at some fonts. Obviously, there's lots of different fonts to look at. There's lots of different fonts to identify and look at differences, and we'll do that. We'll analyze different fonts. We'll compare different fonts and try to use as much terminology that we're learning from this chapter and some of the other reading to help guide us, so we're not just saying this thing sticking out. So we could say, oh, well, that's the beak coming out, and that's the leg, and that's the terminal, and that's the counter. Already we're trying to start to use that a little bit more. So we're going to continue to do that as we become more aficionados of fonts. That's what we're trying to do here in typography.